From Viking lung displays to Carthaginian child fires, ancient civilizations didn't just punish. They made sure you were never remembered the same way again. These aren't just deaths. They're historical nightmares, and every single one of them actually happened. The Sumerian nail impalement. So, you steal temple grain, fudge a tax record, or insult the king. In modern times, you'd get a fine or maybe a prison cell. But in Sumer, you got nailed. Literally. On a stick. In public. Welcome to Lagash, around 2400 BCE. One of the earliest documented cities with a fully functioning legal system and zero chill. Their version of crime control was short, sharp, and horrifying. The punishment? Impalement. No metaphors here. The body was hoisted onto a wooden stake, probably through the abdomen or chest, and displayed for all to see. This wasn't symbolic, it was the message. The earliest known visual of this method comes from the Stele of the Vultures, a carved limestone slab from Gursu. It shows bodies hanging like gruesome banners, lined up neatly on spikes after a war between Lagash and their farming rivals from Umma. King Eonatum led that campaign, and historians believe he used impalement not just for soldiers, but for rebels, looters, and anyone dumb enough to challenge temple property laws. And they had laws. Cuneiform records written in wedge-shaped symbols talk about penalties for everything, from tax dodging to sacrilege. Several tablets from the city of mention nailing as the outcome for crimes like defiling a shrine or rebelling against the king's word. That meant death by impalement, then public display at the city gate. You became scenery. Unlike later empires, the Sumerians didn't add flair. No ritual chants, no drawn-out speeches. They skewered you, stood you upright, and let the flies do the rest. Experts say the average person might have survived for hours, possibly longer, depending on how the stake was placed. Archaeologists found human remains near city walls that showed deliberate positioning, not a burial. These weren't accidents, they were warnings. Sumer invented the wheel and writing, but they also invented a brutal version of "don't mess with us." And thanks to stone tablets and artistic receipts, we know exactly what happened when you crossed the line. Retainer sacrifice in early dynastic Egypt. In today's job market, people quit for bad hours or a toxic boss. In early dynastic Egypt, you died when your boss did. On purpose. With ceremony. Around 2900 BCE, under Pharaoh Jer, possibly Egypt's third king of the first dynasty, the concept of loyalty took a deadly turn. Archaeologists excavating at Abydos found something that made jaws drop and spines freeze. Over 300 human graves neatly arranged around the king's burial chamber. These weren't mass burials. Each person had their own tomb, grave goods, and in some cases, jewelry. Translation? These people weren't slaves. They were high-status retainers, and they were sacrificed. Jer's tomb alone had at least 318 auxiliary burials, according to W.B. Emery's detailed archaeological reports. Some victims appear to have been strangled, possibly with linen cords, and carefully buried shortly after death. No broken bones, no signs of a struggle. Just bodies placed with precision, as if they'd volunteered to clock out of life permanent. But they didn't volunteer. These were likely court servants, nurses, cooks, guards, and even musicians. When the pharaoh died, they were killed so they could serve him in the afterlife. Think of it as an ancient office culture where quitting wasn't an option, and HR wore linen shrouds. And it wasn't just Jer. His predecessors, like King Aha, also had dozens of retainers buried alongside them. Tomb Uj, possibly belonging to the mysterious proto-king Scorpion I, revealed bodies with evidence of decapitation, not for rebellion, just for proximity to power. For 3 generations, this deadly tradition continued. Pharaoh dies, his staff dies with him, but eventually even Egypt realized this was getting out of hand. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Pharaoh Khsekhemwy's tomb included Shabti figurines, small statues meant to work for him in the afterlife. Plastic employees, ancient edition, much cheaper, much less bloody. So next time your boss sends a passive-aggressive email, remember, at least you're not being strangled and buried in his tomb. Progress. The Hittite burning ritual. The Hittites ran their empire like a strict school with a flamethrower. They had rules, hundreds of them, etched into clay tablets, and if you broke one in a way that offended the gods, fire. Somewhere around 1400 BCE, the Hittites were ruling much of Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey. Their legal codes, especially tablets from the capital Hattusa, didn't hold back. Among the most terrifying lines in the Code of the Hittites, burning as a punishment for certain religious crimes. And we're not talking symbolic burning here. We're talking actual live immolation, sometimes done in public, always with purpose. The Hittites were obsessed with purity, ritual, spiritual, and political. If someone insulted a temple, defiled sacred space, or violated oaths to the gods, they weren't just killed. They were given to the fire. One tablet outlines the punishment for desecrating temple food. The offender shall not live and be burned in a ritual cleansing. This wasn't daily justice. Regular criminals got fines, lashes, or exile. But blasphemers? They got flames. There are records of priests and scribes performing fire ceremonies where condemned individuals were burned to appease angry gods, especially the storm god Tarhunt. And this wasn't clean or quick. It wasn't supposed to be. The burning was both punishment and purification, a violent reset button. Victims were sometimes burned at the edge of temples, where offerings were made. Their deaths were meant to carry the spiritual weight of cleansing the community. It's worth noting, the Hittites didn't use this on political rebels or common thieves. This was sacred punishment, aimed squarely at those seen as spiritual threats. Think heretics, oath-breakers, and people who insulted divine order. Archaeologists have found charred human remains in and near ceremonial fire pits in sites like Yazilikaya and Alaka-Huyuk. While we can't assign each bone to a crime, the placement and context match with ritual descriptions in the tablets. So, yes, the Hittites were legal pioneers. But if you ever find yourself time-traveling to Bronze Age Anatolia, here's a tip. Don't mess with the temple bread, or the gods might bake you. Tower crucifixion in Achaemenid Persia. Persia had palaces, postal systems, and some of the worst ways to die if you annoyed the king. Top of the list? Crucifixion. But this wasn't Rome yet. The Persians did it higher, slower, and with extra humiliation. Let's rewind to 522 BCE, when Darius I had just taken the throne. It wasn't peaceful. A rebel named Nidintubel popped up in Babylon claiming to be the long-lost King Nebuchadnezzar III. That went over poorly. Darius crushed the rebellion and made sure nobody forgot it. According to the Behistun inscription, a trilingual rock-carved record Darius left like a Bronze Age press release, the fake king was captured and publicly crucified. Now, Persian crucifixion wasn't the same as the Roman version. They didn't nail people to T-shaped crosses. They used wooden beams or tall stakes, often placing them high above city gates or on towers. Why? So the corpse could hang there for days, rotting in the sun, visible to everyone, a warning from 40 feet up. Greek historians backed it up. Herodotus, not exactly subtle, said Darius had tens of thousands of men crucified in Babylon after one revolt. That's not poetic language, that's logistics. Thousands of vertical poles lined up outside the city, each with a body swinging from it like some horrific fence. And it wasn't just for rebels. Persian law under Darius allowed crucifixion for soldiers who deserted, nobles who plotted coups, and even corrupt officials. According to Ctesias, another Greek source, one corrupt judge was flayed alive and then nailed to a post made of his own skin, creative HR. This method didn't end with Darius. His successors, including Xerxes, used it during military campaigns. After the failed invasion of Greece, Xerxes reportedly crucified his own engineers for screwing up a bridge over the Hellespont. Harsh Yelp review. Now, if you were climbing the political ladder in Achaemenid Persia, here's the rule. Don't fake your resume. Darius didn't just end your rebellion. He hung you on a pole and carved your failure into stone. Literally. Scaphism, the Persian death that took days. If crucifixion was the Persian billboard for traitors, scaphism was the underground horror show. No spikes and swords, only milk, honey, and bugs. And it may be the slowest, grossest execution ever recorded. The story comes from Plutarch, who, in Life of Artaxerxes, gives a detailed and very real account of what happened to a Persian soldier named Mithridates around 401 BCE. His crime? He accidentally bragged that he, not the king's brother Cyrus, killed a rival in battle. Big mistake. The king, Artaxerxes II, decided to make him an example. A long, slow, squirming one. Here's how it worked. The condemned was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or logs, exposing only the head, hands, and feet. Then, he was force-fed milk and honey until he developed massive, uncontrollable diarrhea. The executioners then smeared more milk and honey over his exposed skin and left him floating in a stagnant swamp. The result? Insects. Thousands of them. They didn't just bite. They nested. They burrowed. They laid eggs in his skin, mouth, and eyes. Every day, the victim was cleaned up just enough to keep him alive, then fed again, and again, and again. According to Plutarch, Mithridates lasted 17 days before finally dying. 17 days. That's over 2 weeks of rot, infection, madness, and slow digestion by insects. It wasn't just physical torture. It was psychological annihilation. Historians have debated whether this punishment was common. There's no evidence it was widespread. It wasn't used on peasants or petty thieves. This was a royal punishment, reserved for people who insulted the king or committed grave political blunders. A method so vile, it didn't need to be used often, but just whispered about. And while Plutarch was Greek, other sources confirm similar punishment styles involving entrapment, exposure, and forced feeding as a form of ritual disgrace. Scaphism wasn't about killing someone fast. It was about turning a man into a feast for the natural world and letting everyone know. Persia knew how to build roads, irrigate deserts, and manage empires, but they also invented a death so slow. Even crucifixion looked like mercy. Carthaginian child sacrifice. You've heard of ancient gods demanding loyalty. In Carthage, they demanded something else. Your child. And yes, this really happened. Around 300 BCE, the city of Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, was thriving. Powerful navy, booming trade, fancy purple dyes. But behind the marble temples sat a place called the Tophet. It looked like a peaceful cemetery. It wasn't. It was a ritual sacrifice zone, and most of the bodies buried there were children. Ancient writers didn't pull punches. Diodorus Siculus wrote that when Carthage faced disaster, plague, famine, military loss, they believed their god Baal-Hamon was angry. And the only way to fix it? Burn children alive, not figuratively, actually, in a bronze furnace shaped like a god with outstretched arms. You'd place the child in the statue's hands. The priest pulled a lever. The child rolled into a pit of fire. Some kids were volunteered by wealthy families trying to impress the gods. Others, historians think, were poor or enslaved. Carthaginian elites even claimed they were sacrificing surrogates, children raised for this. Nice try, the bones don't lie. In the 20th century, skeptics said Roman authors made this up to smear Carthage. Then, archaeologists started digging. What they found? Thousands of urns in the Tophets of Carthage, Motia, and other Punic sites are packed with charred infant bones and animal remains. Some were newborns, others were toddlers. Studies by archaeologist Lawrence Steger and others proved that the high number of cremated infants couldn't be explained by natural death. The bones were burned at high heat, consistent with large-scale, open-air fire pits or furnaces. And get this, many urns had inscriptions like, "Offering to Baal." No ambiguity. This was child sacrifice. There's even a chilling ritual term, mulk, used in Phoenician texts to describe the offering. It literally means a gift. Eventually, Roman forces obliterated Carthage in 146 BCE, leveling the city. But by then, thousands of children had already been given to the fire in the name of cosmic balance. The Roman poena culae, death by sack. The Romans were obsessed with order. Kill your neighbor? You might get a sword. Kill your father? You got the sack, literally. The punishment was called poena culae, Latin for penalty of the sack, and it was the Roman Republic's way of saying parricide is the worst thing you can do. Forget crucifixion, forget exile. If you killed your dad, or mom, or grandparent, Rome turned your execution into a bizarre animal-filled nightmare. Here's how it worked. First, you were beaten with rods. Then, you were sewn into a leather sack with 4 animals, a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. The symbolism? No one's exactly sure. The dog represented madness, the monkey chaos, the snake betrayal, and the rooster, you guessed it, constant screaming. Basically, you were locked in a screaming, biting, writhing sack of poetic justice. Once sewn in, the sack, called a culeus, was tossed into the Tiber River, or the sea if they felt dramatic. You drowned, but not before the monkey clawed your face and the snake did its thing. In Roman terms, that was total erasure. This wasn't a myth. It's recorded in the Digest of Justinian, a massive Roman law code, and referenced by Cicero, who defended a man accused of parricide. It was used in real Roman courts and carried out for centuries. Even Emperor Hadrian revived it in the 2nd century CE for dramatic effect. Sometimes, if animals weren't available, they improvised. There are records of criminals sewn up solo or with fewer animals. But the symbolism stuck. Parricide didn't just break the law, it shattered the natural order. And Rome made sure you paid for it with every squawk and hiss. It was so specific, so theatrical, and so uniquely Roman that even other brutal civilizations didn't copy it. Leave it to Rome to turn a murder trial into a zoo-themed drowning show. Slow slicing in Han Dynasty China. In ancient China, they didn't just punish you, they processed you. And if your crime was big enough, like treason, desertion, or insulting the emperor, they had a punishment to match. Slow slicing, the prototype of what later became known as lingqi. We're in the Western Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE, when Emperor Wu was cracking down on threats, real or imagined. While the fully ritualized lingqi wouldn't be formalized until the Song Dynasty, Early hand texts already describe executions involving gradual dismemberment, piece by piece, while the victim was still alive. The official term? Lingchi, or cut punishment. It was written into legal codes for crimes that offended both the state and heaven. Unlike your standard beheading or hanging, this was reserved for traitors and especially hated criminals. Why? Because in Chinese belief, a whole body was needed for a proper afterlife. The method? First, the prisoner was tied upright. Then, the executioner would slice off the flesh in sections, starting with the arms, the chest, and sometimes even the face. Internal organs were left for last. It wasn't quick. That was the point. You died in stages, fully aware, as each cut robbed you of dignity, life, and afterlife. A few ancient commentaries mention criminals being cut into 8 pieces. Not metaphor, that was the plan, and your family also punished. Your sons could be enslaved, your name banned from being written down. You didn't just lose your life, you lost legacy. Records from this time also describe exemplary punishments, where the condemned were displayed publicly during slicing. Townsfolk were encouraged to watch, children included. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, Lingqi got more elaborate, sometimes involving hundreds of cuts. But the Han set the tone. Execution as erasure, not just of a body, but of a soul. So no, the Han dynasty wasn't just about calligraphy and Confucianism. It also pioneered one of history's most methodical forms of public dismemberment. And if your final moments involved a crowd counting your body parts, you were probably already dead, in every way that mattered. Maya heart extraction ritual. The Maya gave us calendars, pyramids, and math. They also gave us one of the most efficient ways to lose your heart, literally. Because if you were a prisoner of war, or a human offering during certain festivals, you weren't walking away, you were getting carved open on an altar, while still breathing. By 900 CE, in cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, the Maya were performing ritual heart extractions at major temples. This wasn't some back-alley sacrifice. It was state-sponsored religion, often tied to agricultural cycles, calendar rituals, or honoring gods like Kawil and Chak. Here's how it worked. The victim, usually a captured warrior, slave, or even a high-status noble, was painted blue, a color symbolizing death and sacrifice. He was brought to the top of a pyramid, often the temple of Kukulkan, where a priest would lay him flat on a stone altar, sometimes bending his chest over a curved slab for easier access. Then came the blade. Obsidian or flint, razor-sharp but brittle. The priest would make a vertical cut through the chest, reach in and remove the still-beating heart. Yes, this is real. Spanish conquistadors like Diego de Landa and later chroniclers wrote about it in grim detail, and Maya carvings and murals back it up, showing the scene repeatedly, like a spiritual instruction manual. The heart was then offered to the gods, either burned as incense or placed on a sacred plate. In some cases, the body was tossed down the temple stairs, a final flourish to the ceremony. Fun fact? Some bodies were later flayed or decapitated as part of additional rituals, especially during ball games, where winners, or losers, were sometimes sacrificed too. Archaeologists have found human remains at Maya temples showing chest incisions, cut ribs, and missing sternums, physical proof that this wasn't just legend. It was practiced for centuries, deeply tied to Maya beliefs about feeding the gods and maintaining cosmic balance. To the Maya, sacrifice wasn't cruelty. It was currency, a way to keep the sun rising and the crops growing. But for the guy on the altar, let's be honest, he didn't care about balance. He just lost the worst lottery in history, and his heart paid the price. The Viking blood eagle. You've heard of Viking raids, but have you heard of the execution that made even warriors flinch? It was called the blood eagle, and if the sagas are even halfway true, it wasn't just a death. It was a performance. The blood eagle shows up in Icelandic texts like the Tale of Ragnar's Sons and the Orkneyinga saga, written a couple centuries after the events they describe. The setup? A high-status enemy commits treason, kills a family member, or breaks an oath. The punishment? You get turned into an offering with your back wide open. Here's how it allegedly went. The victim was tied face down. Then, the executioner used a sharp blade, probably a CX or long knife, to slice open the rib cage from the spine, separating the ribs like wings. Each rib was pulled outward. The lungs were then dragged out through the opening and laid over the ribs, fluttering like wings. Hence, the eagle. Was it fast? Not even close. The point was to keep the person alive during the process, at least through the rib carving. The ultimate humiliation was making the lungs appear to flap, while the person still gasped for air. You weren't just being killed. You were being displayed like a grotesque banner of dishonor. One of the most famous alleged victims was King Ella of Northumbria, the guy who killed legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar's sons captured Ella and performed the blood eagle on him as revenge. Whether it really happened? Still debated. But the ritual pops up in multiple texts, usually as punishment for oath-breaking or regicide, the worst crimes in Viking law. Skeptics say it's a literary invention, more poetic than practical. But some historians argue it could be physically possible, if horrifying. At least partial versions of it. Either way, it was meant to terrify. There's no archaeological proof yet, no carved-back skeletons have been found, but the idea of a death so gruesome it survives centuries of storytelling? That says something. Whether fully real or slightly embellished, the Blood Eagle remains one of the darkest executions ever whispered through history. Not just because of what it did to the body, but because of what it did to the reputation of anyone who saw it. In Viking culture, honor was everything, but this was how you ended someone forever.